If there is one story powerful enough to make people shiver from the very first second, it is not a story about war, and it is not about the collapse of an empire. It is the story of the moment human beings began to believe they no longer needed to wait for God. No need for pleading, no need for submission, just enough knowledge, enough secrets, enough power. And from that moment, history began to slide onto a road that no one could reverse. Stop for 1 second and ask yourself, what is more terrifying? A person who knows nothing, or a person who believes they know enough to control everything? Babylon entered history not only because of towers that seemed to reach the sky or walls that looked unstoppable, but because it marked the moment when knowledge was no longer pursued in order to understand, but in order to cross the limit. Babylon was not simply a city. It was a spiritual condition, a moment in the human story when the question, what is right, was replaced by the question, how can we be faster, stronger, more powerful? The people of Babylon were not backward. They were intelligent, refined, skilled in astronomy, language, and the laws of nature. But that very understanding planted a deadly illusion. If the universe runs on laws, then by mastering those laws, human beings can bend outcomes. From that point on, knowledge began to wear a different face. It was no longer a light that guides, but a key that opens doors that should have remained closed. And when knowledge separates from humility, it stops being a gift and becomes a temptation. The most frightening thing is not when people oppose God with violence. The most frightening thing is when they believe they can replace him with formulas, rituals, and secret invocations. No more prayer, only procedure. No more trust, only control. No more waiting, only forcing results to happen on their own terms. That is when the boundary between knowledge and arrogance is erased, and humanity steps into a realm where everything can be done, but not everything is permitted. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we do not only retell history, but uncover the most dangerous moments in the spiritual journey of humankind. And if you think this story belongs only to a vanished civilization, be careful. Because Babylon did not die with fallen walls. Babylon lives on in the way modern people look at knowledge and power. Look closely at that turning point. At first, everything is subtle. People want to understand a little more, move a little faster, feel a little more certain about outcomes. But those small steps added together become a leap over a sacred limit. When knowledge is no longer placed under submission, it begins to demand mastery. And when knowledge demands mastery, it is never satisfied. It always wants more, deeper, farther, until it touches what is forbidden. Babylon became the symbol of that moment in human history. Not a moment of ignorance, but a moment of excessive confidence. The moment people believed that if they knew enough, they could rewrite destiny. But that is where the real test begins, not the test of scarcity, but the test of abundance. Not the test of fear, but the test of ambition. And this is what makes the story more terrifying than any disaster. There are no loud warning signs, no immediate catastrophe, only a quiet question echoing inside every heart. When you are given the chance to cross the boundary, will you stop or will you continue? That question was asked in Babylon, but it never stopped echoing. It is still here today in our own time, when knowledge spreads faster than reflection and power can be activated with a few simple touches. If something in this story feels familiar, you are not imagining it. And if you want to understand why a brilliant civilization became the stage for one of the harshest tests ever placed before human beings, stay until the end. Because the conclusion of this story is not buried in the past. It is hidden in the choices we face every day. If stories like this make you pause and think, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us, so we can keep creating deep, honest, and awakening videos like this in the time ahead. What makes the test in Babylon different from every other story of punishment in history is the silence of the punishment. No sky of fire, no trembling earth, no sign that disaster is about to descend. Everything continues as normal. The city lives, people trade, study, and build. And in that normality, the most dangerous test is set in motion. Allah did not choose to frighten people into turning back. He did not force belief through the pressure of destruction. Instead, he placed before them a bare truth. Knowledge can lead to the loss of faith if the heart is not humble enough. And so that truth would not remain hidden, Allah sent to Babylon 2 angels, not to judge, but to expose the true nature of every choice. Harut and Marut did not appear as shadowy figures in secret corners. They did not entice, they did not promise, they did not seduce. Their presence was direct, almost unsettling. Anyone who approached them heard the same warning, unchanged, unsoftened. We are only a test. Do not lose your faith. Those words were not spoken for effect. They were spoken to draw a clear line between what is permitted and what is forbidden. No one could say they did not know. So the test was not in the knowledge offered, but in the absolute freedom of choice. No one was forced to learn. No one was lured by fear. People were placed in a position where they had to decide who they truly were without external pressure. And that is when the unsettling truth emerges. When there is no threat and no coercion, human desire and real intention become most visible. Some heard the warning and turned away immediately. They understood that there are things that, even if reachable, should never be touched. But others remained. Not because they denied Allah, but because they believed they were strong enough to step into forbidden territory without losing themselves. That belief was the beginning of the fall. Not disbelief, but confidence beyond what is allowed. Allah did not hide the danger of the test. He did not disguise it as a clever trap. On the contrary, He made the boundary so clear that anyone who crossed it did so with full awareness. This was not a test of ignorance. It was a test of inner motives. Whoever sought knowledge in order to understand and submit would stop. Whoever sought knowledge in order to control would continue. The fairness of the test lies here. No one was deceived. No one was pushed into error against their will. People were not judged for curiosity, but for choosing to use that curiosity to cross a sacred boundary. And in that clarity, Allah reveals a deep principle. Faith is not proven by words, but by the ability to refuse power when power is within reach. Harut and Marut did not act as teachers in the ordinary sense. They did not build a community. They did not spread an ideology. They did not search for successors. Each time they spoke, they repeated the same warning, like a bell ringing again and again to see who could still hear it when desire began to grow louder than fear. The test did not change its shape. Only the people facing it changed. What makes this test so profound is not immediate consequence, but delayed consequence. People were not punished the moment they crossed the boundary. Life continued. That is why many began to believe they were right, that the warning was only symbolic. But the delay is the most dangerous part of the test because it feeds the illusion that you can cross the limit without paying a price. In His perfect wisdom, Allah gives human beings time to reveal themselves, time for desire to grow on its own, time for choices to be repeated, reinforced, and eventually become character. The test does not end in a single act, but in a chain of decisions. And when that chain is complete, the verdict has already been written by human hands. This is why the story never becomes old, because it does not speak of a city that collapsed, but of how Allah tests those who are given knowledge, not by taking it away, but by allowing it, not through coercion, but through freedom. And within that freedom, people must answer the hardest question. When no one stops you, when consequences have not yet appeared, will you choose submission, or will you cross the boundary? The test in Babylon does not need thunder to be terrifying. It is terrifying because it is so fair, so clear, and so similar to the choices people still face every day. At first, nothing loud happens. There is no sign that Babylon is sliding into danger. Those who stay behind do not see themselves as rebels, and they do not imagine they are opposing God. They only believe they know a little more than others. And that belief, just a little more, becomes the door to the deepest distortion of knowledge. Not everyone who hears the warning leaves. Some remain not because they deny Allah, but because they believe their faith is strong enough to enter the forbidden without harm. They do not seek destruction. They seek advantage. They want what others do not have. They want to move ahead. They want certainty that outcomes will favor them. And in their minds, knowledge is only a tool. If used correctly, it cannot be called sin. The first steps are always small and appear harmless. An invocation to keep a fading love from leaving. A ritual to slow an opponent's progress. A formula to shift fortune. No one thinks they are breaking society. They believe they are only adjusting it. But when knowledge is used to serve the ego, it never stays at adjustment. It expands, it seeps in, and eventually it takes over the moral space of an entire community. From private rooms, that knowledge pours into the streets. It does not look like violence, so no one calls it war. But it is a war, an invisible one. Relationships are manipulated, trust is torn from the inside. Family, commerce, and honor become pieces on a board where rules are no longer respected. Babylon does not collapse because it lacks order, but because too many people believe they have the right to rewrite order. The most dangerous part of the process is normalization. When knowledge is abused for long enough, it no longer shocks. It becomes part of life. People no longer ask whether it is right, they only ask whether it works. And when effectiveness becomes the only measure, morality is pushed aside as a luxury. No one calls themselves evil. Everyone has a reason. The one who breaks a marriage says they only want to keep what belongs to them. The one who harms a rival says the world is competitive and the slower will be eliminated. Each reason sounds reasonable in isolation. But together they produce a society where hidden power is handed to those willing to cross the line farther than anyone else. Knowledge at that point is no longer a light that guides. It becomes a form of subtle domination. It needs no armies and no weapons, yet it controls behavior and emotion. And this domination is more dangerous than violence because it makes the victim believe they are acting freely. No one is chained in iron, but many are bound by invisible threads of fear, dependence, and manipulation. What makes Babylon a great lesson is not the level of magic. It is the way human beings use knowledge to replace trust. When results can be forced, people stop waiting. When destiny can be manipulated, people stop pleading. And when power can be taken through secrets, people no longer feel the need to submit. That is the moment knowledge places itself where it was never allowed to stand. No boundary is crossed in a single step. Everything happens in small movements, and each step can be justified. But that chain is what makes it terrifying. Because when people look back, they no longer remember when they crossed the line. They only know they went too far to return. And at that point, knowledge no longer serves people. People begin to serve knowledge as if it were the highest authority. In that stage, Babylon is no longer a test for individuals alone. It becomes a system, an environment where anyone who refuses to participate will be left behind. And when social pressure begins to reward the abuse of knowledge, the test is no longer about whether you will learn or not. It is about whether you will dare to refuse. Whether you will stand outside a power that is being celebrated. Here, the essence of the test becomes clearest. Allah does not test people by taking knowledge away, but by letting knowledge expose the heart. Whoever uses it to serve will stop. Whoever uses it to dominate will continue until the very thing they hold turns and devours them. And Babylon at that point does not need a sentence from the heavens. It writes its own sentence through choices that seemed reasonable. Up to this point, someone might think the test of Babylon revolves only around human beings. But that is only the surface. The deepest layer is not what people do with knowledge, but what happens when even light must enter human conditions. Because Harut and Marut were not sent down only to observe, they were sent down to experience. They did not carry the cold detachment of the heavens. For the first time, they carried emotion, not vague feeling, but concrete movements of the heart, curiosity, closeness, attraction, and most of all, the sensation of being chosen. This was something they had never known before. In the heavens, there is no inner struggle, no what if, no gray zone. Obedience is as natural as light flowing from their own nature. But under human conditions, obedience is no longer instinct. It becomes a decision. And there, the question first asked at the beginning of time begins to reveal its answer. When human beings are given freedom, they do not only face evil, they face the ability to persuade themselves that evil can be acceptable. Harut and Marut entered that world not intending to fall, but confident they would not fall. But every test in history proves the same thing. Confidence in oneself in the presence of temptation is always a dangerous weakness. The appearance of Zura, according to narrations, is not crude temptation. She does not beg, she does not plead, she does not use weakness to sway them. She appears with intelligence, calmness, and a request presented as if it were simply the next logical step. Not an obvious sin, but a small exception. Not an open betrayal, but one slight step beyond the boundary. And it is those small exceptions that have defeated countless hearts across history. In that moment, Harut and Marut do not face obvious evil. They face reasons to justify, the reason that no one will know, the reason that consequences can be controlled, the reason that the end can justify the means. This is not the language of angels. This is deeply human language, and once they begin thinking in that language, the test enters its decisive stage. If the fall happens, what makes the story different is not the act itself, but what comes immediately after. There is no denial, no delay, no attempt to conceal. Regret arrives instantly, heavy and complete. Harut and Marut understand at once that they have crossed a boundary that cannot be treated as if it never existed. And in that awareness, they taste something many human beings only learn after a lifetime. Sin is not in being tempted, but in accepting temptation while knowing exactly what it is. That moment of regret overturns the entire way we view the story. Harut and Marut do not become symbols of rebellion. They become symbols of moral responsibility. They do not flee consequences. They do not ask to be exempt. They return to Allah, not to demand their position back, but to acknowledge the justice of judgment. And here a deep lesson is engraved. True repentance is not the desire to escape consequences, but the willingness to face them. Their test, therefore, is not like the test of human beings. Humans often fall first and think later. Harut and Marut think first and then fall, and that is why their pain is deeper. They understand fully what they have lost, not because they are punished, but because they crossed the boundary by their own choice. Through them, human weakness becomes harder to judge. Because if beings created from light can tremble before choice, then human wavering is no longer mysterious. This is the layer the story wants to reach, not to diminish angels, but to show that the human test is not small. Freedom is not a gentle gift. It is a weight that even those who had never known sin must bow under once they carry it. Harut and Marut in that moment do not only represent the heavens. They become a mirror reflecting how fragile every created being becomes when standing at the edge of choice. And here the story takes on a new shade. It is no longer about who is right or wrong. It becomes about the humility required before freedom. Because when light enters human conditions, it is no longer protected by nature. It must be protected by choice. And choice, as history proves, is the hardest place to remain pure. The punishment of Harut and Marut does not feel like an ending. It does not close the story with fire or destruction. It opens a suspended state that makes anyone who reflects feel a chill. Hanging between sky and earth, they no longer belong to what they once called home, yet they have not been pushed into final judgment. This is not cheap mercy, and it is not cold punishment. It is the most symbolic consequence of all. Living with awareness, living with responsibility, living with the memory of the boundary that was crossed. In that state, Harut and Marut are no longer messengers of knowledge, and they are no longer a source of power for people to chase. They become a moral marker frozen in time, a quiet reminder that some choices once made cannot be erased by regret alone. True repentance does not remove consequences. It only keeps the soul from sinking deeper into arrogance. And in that long silence, the lesson is engraved more deeply than any sermon. Babylon with time fell. The structures that made people believe they could touch the sky became ruins. But the test did not disappear with broken bricks. It continued, no longer named Babylon, no longer dressed in ancient rituals, but hidden in more refined forms. The test no longer asks whether people believe. It asks whether people know how to stop when they have the ability to do too much. What makes the punishment of Harut and Marut so haunting is not pain, but duration. Time here is not passive waiting. It is the constant exposure of conscience. Suspended between two worlds, they become a symbol of a condition modern people recognize well. No longer innocent enough to be carefree and not pure enough to be at peace. It is the condition of those who have seen too much, done too much, and now must live with the question of whether their knowledge was used to serve or to dominate. This story does not ask the listener to fear knowledge. It asks the listener to fear the loss of boundaries. Because knowledge, once it is no longer placed under submission, begins to demand mastery. And when knowledge becomes master, people confuse ability with permission. Harut and Marut were not punished for knowing, but for crossing the boundary of what was permitted, even though they understood the price. In today's world, that test no longer appears through secret invocations or ancient rituals. It appears through powerful tools, systems that can manipulate emotion, direct behavior, and shape the fate of millions. Every time people choose to use knowledge to force instead of uplift, to control instead of serve, the test of Babylon is activated again. And what is most frightening is that the test often comes without immediate punishment. It allows people to continue to succeed, even to be praised, while moral boundaries are worn down little by little. The suspended punishment of Harut and Marut, therefore, is not only about them. It speaks to a deep law of spiritual life. Some consequences do not strike like thunder, but seep in like poisonous mist. People do not realize they have been bound until they awaken and find they no longer stand firmly anywhere. And at that point, returning is no longer as simple as a momentary decision. It becomes a long journey of repair and responsibility. The story closes not in despair, but in a warning filled with stern hope. Harut and Marut are not erased from memory, and they are not locked away as symbols of failure. They remain as a reminder that even after a fall, the path of repentance and responsibility is still open. But that path does not promise ease. It demands patience, humility, and the acceptance that some scars will follow a person to the end of the road. So the test of Babylon does not end with a city that vanished. It echoes in every small choice a person makes. When standing before the power that knowledge can bring, the question is no longer what we can do, but what we should do. And sometimes the deepest loyalty is not found in bold action, but in the decision to stop, to turn away from temptation, and to accept moving more slowly within the light of submission. The greatest lesson of this story is not in magic or mysterious details, but in a very ordinary question. When you have the ability to control, will you choose control or will you choose trust? When you have tools that can force outcomes, will you use them or will you accept waiting? And when temptation comes dressed as knowledge, do you have the humility to stop? The story reminds us that not everything that can be done should be done, and not every form of knowledge is a gift if it pulls us outside moral boundaries. In daily life, this lesson can be applied in very concrete ways. Every time you face an advantage that can be gained by bending principles, remember Babylon. Every time you have the chance to manipulate others with what you know, ask yourself whether that is serving or dominating. And every time you feel smarter, faster, one step ahead, stop and examine whether your heart is being led by faith or by ego. Awareness is not rejecting knowledge. Awareness is placing knowledge in its proper place, under humility and a clear recognition of limits. If you find value in spiritual history like this, join the Prophetic History Explained community as we explore more lessons about faith, the histories of peoples, and the spiritual tests that continue in the modern world. And do not forget to subscribe to support Prophetic History Explained so we can keep creating high-quality, deep, and meaningful content in the videos to come.